The twin suns burned over the red horizon, and the desert winds carried the smell of dust and sorrow. A small alien girl, her skin pale blue and her eyes large like crystals, sat beside a broken hut made of metal scraps. Her stomach growled with hunger, but she tried not to cry anymore, because tears only brought her sister pain. Her older sister, Lyra, looked at the fading light in the sky and counted the last few seeds left in her hand. She had already sold everything they owned, even their mother's necklace, but the seeds could not grow in the poisoned soil. Each day the land became colder at night, hotter in the morning, and emptier of life. Lyra touched her sister's face gently, whispering that tomorrow they would eat, even though she knew it was a lie. Hope was the only thing left to feed her little sister, whose name was Asha. Asha's small voice broke the silence, asking, "Lyra, do humans have food?" Lyra froze, looking toward the distant lights across the dunes where the humans had built their settlement. The aliens called it the Iron Valley, where trade was forbidden unless one had something to offer. And the only thing Lyra had left was herself. That night, when the stars appeared like cold sparks in the black sky, Lyra wrapped her sister in a torn blanket. She told her stories about the time before the famine, when their planet had oceans and forests. Asha smiled faintly, imagining trees she had never seen. Then she fell asleep in her sister's arms, her tiny hand clutching a small metal pendant. Lyra stayed awake, staring into the distance where human machines glowed like fireflies. Rumors said humans were cruel, but others whispered that some still had mercy. She remembered the human soldier who once gave them water before being ordered to leave their zone. That small act had burned itself into her heart. Her hunger was not only for food anymore, it was for hope, for a chance to keep her sister alive another day. But the price of survival had become higher than ever. As she rose to her feet, she felt the cold wind biting her skin. Her reflection in a piece of metal showed eyes filled with both fear and determination. She looked at the horizon once more and whispered, "I will bring you food, Asha, even if I have to give up everything." Her voice trembled, but her heart stood firm. She took a final look at her sleeping sister, memorizing her gentle breathing and fragile warmth. Then she began walking toward the lights of the human colony, each step heavier than the last. The sands whispered around her feet, as if warning her to turn back. But Lyra no longer cared for warnings. She had already lost too much. The wind carried the scent of metal and smoke from the human zone. Her mind replayed stories of humans taking slaves, using aliens for labor, or worse. But she told herself that maybe one human would see her not as a creature, but as a sister. When she finally reached the edge of the human outpost, guards stood with glowing weapons. Lyra hid behind a broken vehicle, watching their faces, strong, weary, human. She wanted to speak, to ask for help, but words refused to come out. Then she saw a tall man in a long coat approach the guards and hand them a bag of grain. He laughed softly, his face tired but kind. Something about him felt different. Maybe he was the one. Lyra stepped out from the shadows, trembling, her voice barely a whisper. "Please, my sister is starving," she said. The humans turned toward her, eyes narrowing, hands reaching for their weapons. For a moment, silence ruled the night. Then the man in the coat raised his hand and said, "Wait." His voice carried strength, but also curiosity. He looked at her, really looked, and saw the fear, the desperation, the love behind her words. The other soldiers hesitated, but he took a step closer. "Who are you?" he asked quietly. Lyra lowered her head, whispering, "A sister, nothing more." The man's expression softened. He didn't know then, but that single moment of mercy would change both their worlds forever. The night air trembled with tension as the human soldier stood before the alien girl, his shadow stretching long beneath the moons. Lyra's heart pounded like a drum, every breath burning her chest, yet she refused to look away. The man's gaze was sharp but calm, the kind of eyes that had seen too much war and not enough peace. He lowered his weapon slightly and spoke, "You shouldn't be here." His voice was heavy, filled with both warning and wonder. "I had no choice," Lyra whispered, her voice trembling. "My sister, she hasn't eaten in 3 days." A flicker of humanity crossed his face, something fragile, something hidden under duty. Behind him, the other soldiers muttered, calling her names, telling him to drive her away. But he raised a hand, silencing them. He could see the dirt on her skin, the thin bones beneath, the courage behind her tears. "What's your name?" he asked. "Lyra," she said softly, "from the village of Van." He frowned slightly. "That place was destroyed months ago." Lyra nodded slowly. "I know, we survived the firestorm, but the land is dead now." For a moment, the man said nothing, just stared at her as if trying to measure her soul. Then he sighed, removed a ration pack from his coat, and tossed it toward her. "Take it," he said quietly, "but go back before my commander sees you." Lyra caught the pack with shaking hands, staring at it like it was gold from the heavens. "Thank you," she breathed, her eyes wide with disbelief. He turned to leave, but her voice stopped him again. "Please, sir," she said, her voice breaking. "I'll do anything, just help my sister, she's only a child." The man froze, his back still turned. There was something in her tone that pierced through the armor of training, something raw and pure. He didn't answer right away, but his silence spoke of conflict. Finally, he muttered, "You shouldn't have to do anything. Just take the food and go." Lyra's knees gave way, the exhaustion crashing over her. Tears filled her eyes. "Humans don't help for free," she said, almost whispering to herself. That sentence hit him harder than a bullet. He turned around slowly, looking at her, truly seeing her this time. A starving young woman trying to keep hope alive for a child who still believed in dreams. The rations in his hands suddenly felt heavier. He crouched down and said softly, "Not all humans are monsters, Lyra." She looked up, her eyes glimmering in the dim light. "Then prove it." The man exhaled deeply, knowing what it might cost him. His name was Captain Reed, a field officer who had once believed in peace between worlds. Now he stood between his orders and his conscience. "Where is your sister?" he asked. Lyra hesitated, then pointed toward the dark dunes. "Not far. I hid her in the old wrecks." "Bring her here," he said, "but hurry." Lyra blinked in disbelief, then nodded and ran back through the sand, her heart pounding with a fragile flame of hope. The wind howled, but her feet barely touched the ground. When she reached the shelter, Asha was awake, staring with tired eyes. "Lyra," she whispered weakly, "you came back." Lyra smiled through her tears. "Yes, little star, I came back." She lifted her sister into her arms and carried her through the dark. When they returned, Reed was waiting near a small fire behind the outpost. He had hidden the light with metal sheets, shielding them from patrol eyes. "Sit," he said simply, and handed Asha a small container of warm stew. The little alien hesitated, looking up at him with fear. "It's all right," Reed said gently. "Eat." Asha obeyed, her trembling hands clutching the container. Lyra watched, unable to stop the tears from falling. Reed turned away slightly, trying to hide the emotion in his eyes. He knew this act could destroy his career, but something inside him refused to care. He had seen enough battles to know mercy was rarer than victory. When Asha finished eating, she smiled faintly for the first time in weeks. That smile burned into his memory like sunlight on frozen glass. But before Lyra could thank him again, voices shouted from the distance. Patrol lights flashed across the sand. "Hide," Reed whispered quickly. Lyra grabbed her sister and crouched behind the wreckage, her heart pounding. Reed stood up straight, his face becoming stone once more. Two officers approached, their eyes suspicious. "Captain Reed," one barked, "we saw movement out here." Reed met his gaze calmly. "Just a fox scavenging, sir." The officer frowned, looking around, then nodded reluctantly. "Be careful," he said. "These aliens sneak close at night." As they walked away, Lyra's breath finally returned. When it was safe again, Reed knelt beside her hiding spot. "Tomorrow," he whispered, "come back here before dawn, bring your sister, and don't be seen." Lyra stared at him in confusion. "Why?" He smiled faintly. "Because no child deserves to starve under my watch." For the first time in her life, Lyra believed that maybe, just maybe, one human could change everything. The first light of dawn crept over the dunes, painting the barren world in faded gold. Lyra held Asha close as they approached the human outpost once again, her heart a mix of fear and fragile hope. Every step felt like walking on glass. One wrong move could mean death. The memory of Captain Reed's promise was the only thing giving her the courage to keep going. Reed waited near the same wrecked wall where they had met the night before. He looked different in the morning light, tired but somehow calmer. When he saw them, his face softened, and for a brief moment, Lyra forgot that he was human. "Come quickly," he whispered, gesturing them toward a hidden gate behind a pile of machinery. They slipped through the shadows, and within minutes they were inside the lower section of the outpost. The air smelled of oil, rust, and faint electricity, a world built for machines rather than hearts. Reed guided them into a storage room filled with crates and old uniforms. "This place isn't patrolled," he said quietly. "You'll be safe here for now." Lyra looked around, her eyes wide. "Why are you helping us?" Reed paused, as if searching for the right words. "Because once," he said softly, "someone helped me when I didn't deserve it." His voice carried the weight of old scars, and for a moment, the barrier between human and alien disappeared. He opened a small container and took out bread and dried fruit, handing them to Asha. The little alien smiled shyly before eating. Lyra bowed her head, whispering her thanks. "You don't need to thank me," he said, "but you do need to promise something." She looked up, cautious. "What kind of promise?" "That you'll keep this a secret," he said firmly. "If they find you here, they'll call you a spy, and I'll be court-martialed." Lyra's heart clenched. "I understand," she said quietly. "I swear no one will know." Reed nodded, his eyes serious but kind. He turned to leave, but Asha tugged on his sleeve. "Are humans always this kind?" she asked in her small trembling voice. Reed smiled sadly. "No, little one, but I'm trying to be." Then he left, the metal door closing softly behind him. Hours passed, and Lyra watched Asha sleep peacefully for the first time in weeks. She couldn't remember the last time she had felt a moment of calm. Yet something in her chest warned her that peace in a human outpost could never last long. That evening, Reed returned carrying 2 blankets and a small canister of water. He sat on the floor beside the door, sighing deeply. "The commander suspects something," he said quietly. "We'll have to be careful." Lyra's breath caught. "Will they hurt us?" "Not if I can help it," Reed replied. "But I can't protect you if they find out." Lyra studied his face, the faint scar near his temple, the exhaustion in his eyes. She realized then that this man carried burdens far heavier than orders. "Why do you care so much?" she asked. Reed hesitated, then looked at her with quiet honesty. "Because I once watched a child starve, and I did nothing," he said, his voice shaking. "I won't make that mistake again." The room fell silent except for the hum of the generators. Lyra felt something stir inside her, something she hadn't felt in a long time. It wasn't fear or hunger, but trust, fragile and strange. She wanted to believe that this human's mercy was real. But deep inside, she knew mercy always came with a price. That night, as the suns disappeared beyond the horizon, Reed gave her a small device. "It's a communicator," he said. "If anything happens, press this button and I'll come." Lyra held it carefully, as if it were a piece of her fate. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice full of emotion. Reed gave a faint smile. "Get some rest, both of you." Then he turned and walked out into the cold night air. But before he could reach the end of the corridor, he heard the faint click of boots approaching. 2 officers turned the corner, talking loudly. "Captain Reed," one of them called out. "The commander wants a report about last night's patrol." Reed's heart pounded, but his face remained calm. "Understood," he said. "I was just inspecting storage." They nodded, walking past, unaware that only a thin wall separated them from the very aliens they hunted. When the footsteps faded, Lyra pressed her hand over her mouth, her body trembling. Asha clung to her arm, whispering, "Are we safe?" "For now," Lyra said softly, looking toward the door. Her eyes burned with both gratitude and fear. Because deep down, she knew this fragile secret could not stay hidden forever. Outside, Captain Reed looked up at the rising moon. He knew the lines between loyalty and humanity were beginning to blur. And in that silent moment, under the alien sky, he made a choice that would soon shake the entire outpost. The next few days passed in silence, broken only by the hum of machines and the distant echoes of drills outside the outpost. Lyra and Asha remained hidden in the storage room, living off the rations Captain Reed brought each night. For the first time in months, Asha's cheeks began to show color again, and her laughter returned, soft and innocent like before. Lyra often sat beside her, watching her sleep, whispering thanks to the stars for every moment of peace they still had. But peace, like light in a storm, never lasts long. On the fourth day, a new officer arrived at the base, Lieutenant Corvin, a man known for his cruelty and suspicion toward aliens. He had sharp eyes, like a hawk searching for prey, and a voice that made even soldiers stand straighter. When he walked into the command tent, everyone grew quiet. "Captain Reed," he said coldly, "I've been reviewing your patrol reports, and I noticed inconsistencies." Reed's chest tightened. "Inconsistencies, sir?" Corvin leaned forward, his eyes narrowing. "You reported no sightings near the southern perimeter, yet patrol sensors picked up movement that same night." Reed met his gaze calmly. "It was an animal, sir, nothing more." Corvin smiled thinly. "An animal, perhaps, or maybe something you don't want us to find." Reed felt the weight of those words, but refused to show fear. He gave a sharp salute and walked away, his pulse quickening with every step. He knew the lieutenant was not the kind of man to let a mystery go. That night, he hurried to the storage room earlier than usual. Lyra's face turned pale when she saw his expression. "What's wrong?" she asked. "Someone knows," he said quietly. "You can't stay here anymore." Asha clung to her sister's arm, frightened. "But where will we go?" Lyra asked desperately. Reed rubbed a hand across his face, thinking fast. "There's an old transport tunnel under the outpost, sealed since the war. I'll take you there. It connects to the canyon." He glanced at the door, listening for footsteps. "We'll leave tonight, before the next inspection." Lyra nodded, her throat tight. Part of her wanted to protest, but she knew he was right. The human outpost was no longer safe, and the longer they stayed, the greater the danger to him. When darkness fell, Reed returned wearing a heavy coat and carrying a flashlight. He led them through the narrow corridors of the base, his footsteps silent, his eyes alert. Every shadow seemed alive. Every noise felt like a warning. They reached a metal hatch half buried under pipes. Reed crouched down and pried it open, revealing a dark tunnel leading deep underground. "It's not far," he whispered. "Follow the path until you see light at the other end." Lyra took Asha's hand and turned to look at him one last time. "What will happen to you?" she asked, her voice trembling. Reed smiled faintly. "If I'm lucky, they'll just demote me. If not, well, I've made my choice." Lyra's eyes filled with tears. "You didn't have to risk everything for us." He shook his head. "I did, because if I don't, then what's the point of calling myself human?" Before they could say another word, an alarm blared through the base. The red warning lights flashed across the corridor. Corvin's voice echoed through the speakers. "Unauthorized movement detected in Section C." Reed's face turned pale. "Go now." Lyra grabbed Asha and hurried into the tunnel, her heart racing. Reed slammed the hatch shut behind them and turned to face the direction of the approaching guards. Down in the darkness, Lyra ran through the narrow tunnel, her hands scraping against the cold walls. Asha stumbled but didn't let go. The sound of boots and gunfire echoed above, shaking the ground. She could feel every vibration like a heartbeat of danger closing in. Suddenly, a bright light flickered at the end of the tunnel. "Look!" Asha gasped, pointing ahead. Lyra's lungs burned, but she kept running until they burst out into the open canyon under the night sky. The stars looked closer than ever, glittering like silent witnesses to their escape. Back in the base, Reed stood in the corridor as Corvin arrived with armed soldiers. "Captain Reed," Corvin said sharply, "step aside." Reed crossed his arms, his expression calm but defiant. "You don't need to go in there," he said. Corvin smirked. "Then you won't mind if I do." He ordered his men to open the hatch, but when they looked inside, the tunnel was empty. Corvin's smile faded, replaced by cold fury. He turned toward Reed, his voice low and dangerous. "You helped them, didn't you?" Reed didn't answer, but his silence said everything. The lieutenant's eyes hardened. "Then you've just committed treason." Reed stood tall, his voice steady. "If saving a starving child is treason, then I accept the charge." Corvin's face twisted with rage. "Take him." As the soldiers moved forward, Reed's last thought wasn't of fear, but of hope, that somewhere beyond those walls, two alien sisters were finally free. And as the engines of the outpost roared in the distance, Lyra looked back at the smoke rising behind her, whispering softly, "He saved us." Her voice trembled, but her eyes were filled with something new, the kind of strength born from kindness. The desert winds howled across the empty canyons as Lyra and Asha huddled beside the rocks, their bodies trembling under the cold, alien night. They had escaped the outpost, but safety still felt like a fragile dream. Above them, the twin moons cast pale light over the cracked sand, painting their faces with silver shadows. Asha clung to her sister, whispering, "Will the human be all right?" Lyra looked away, her heart tightening. "He will. He has to," she said, though her voice lacked conviction. Far behind them, inside the human base, Captain Reed stood chained before a panel of officers. His uniform was torn, his face bruised, but his eyes held no regret. Lieutenant Corvin paced before him like a predator. "You risked your command, your life, and our entire mission for 2 aliens," Corvin hissed. Reed remained silent, his jaw tight. "Why?" the lieutenant demanded, slamming his hand on the table. Reed finally raised his head. "Because they were starving, and you call this a mission of peace?" The words hung heavy in the air. One of the officers looked uneasy, but Corvin only sneered. "Peace is earned through control, not pity," he said coldly. "Then maybe that's why humans are still fighting wars," Reed replied, his voice low but firm. The room went still, the kind of silence that feels dangerous. Corvin's lips curled into a cruel smile. "You want to play the hero? Fine. Let's see how long your ideals last without rank or protection." He turned to the guards. "Take him to the lower cells." Reed didn't resist. He just walked forward, his boots echoing across the steel floor. He knew what awaited him. Interrogation, isolation, perhaps worse. But as he was dragged down the corridor, he thought of 2 alien girls running beneath the stars, and that was enough. In the canyon, the first rays of dawn spread across the sand. Lyra watched the horizon with tired eyes, her mind torn between gratitude and guilt. She owed her life to a human who had given up everything. Asha stirred beside her, rubbing her sleepy eyes. "I dreamed he was flying in the sky," she murmured. Lyra smiled faintly, brushing a hand through her sister's hair. "Maybe he's watching over us." But deep inside, she knew the truth. Reed was likely imprisoned because of them. Her conscience gnawed at her like hunger once had. By the second day, they found a small shelter, an old cargo pod half buried in the sand. Lyra used broken panels to block the wind while Asha gathered rocks for warmth. As night fell again, the silence grew heavier. Asha finally asked, "Will we ever see him again?" Lyra hesitated, then whispered, "Maybe one day," though her eyes said otherwise. Back at the outpost, word of Reed's arrest spread quietly among the soldiers. Some whispered that he had gone mad. Others said he had betrayed his kind. But a few, those who had seen the desperation in the aliens' eyes, began to question what orders really meant. Even among humans, seeds of doubt had begun to grow. In the darkness of the cell, Reed sat alone, his hands bound. A single light flickered overhead, casting harsh shadows on the cold floor. He had been questioned for hours, denied sleep, denied food. Yet through it all, he held on to one thought, that his sacrifice had meaning. The echo of Asha's laughter still lingered in his mind, the sound of innocence he had thought lost to the galaxy. When the door opened, he expected another round of interrogation, but instead a quiet voice spoke. "Captain," said a young soldier, barely more than a boy, "I brought you water." Reed looked up in surprise. The soldier glanced around nervously. "My father told me once that good men break bad rules," the young man whispered, leaving the flask before hurrying away. For the first time since his capture, Reed smiled, weakly but truly. Miles away, the alien sisters looked up at the same stars. Lyra's mind burned with memories. Reed's eyes, his words, the warmth in his kindness. Asha fell asleep in her arms, whispering, "He'll come back." Lyra closed her eyes, tears slipping down her cheeks. "If he can, he will," she whispered. The wind carried her words into the sky, as if delivering a message across the distance. By the next morning, she made her choice. She couldn't leave him behind, not after everything he had done. Asha tried to protest, but Lyra's voice was steady. "I'll find him," she said. "I'll bring him back or die trying." She wrapped her sister in a blanket and hid her inside the cargo pod. "Stay here, little star," Don't come out until I return. Asha clutched her sister's hand, her voice trembling. Promise you'll come back. Lyra kissed her forehead gently. I promise. Then she turned toward the horizon, where smoke rose faintly in the distance. The human outpost. Every step forward felt heavier than the last. But her heart was steady, because this time, she wasn't walking for survival. She was walking for redemption, for the human who had risked everything to prove that compassion still existed in a galaxy that had forgotten it. The night was silent except for the whisper of wind moving through the dunes. Lyra wrapped herself in a torn human cloak she had scavenged from the desert wreckage, hiding her pale blue skin beneath the heavy fabric. Her heart pounded with every step as she neared the human outpost once more. The glowing towers of steel and light loomed ahead like giants, reminders of both power and mercy. She remembered the path Captain Reed had once taken her through, the old tunnel beneath the machinery. But now it was sealed, guarded by soldiers who paced back and forth under the harsh glare of lamps. Lyra crouched behind the wreck of a transport drone, watching their movements carefully. Her breath trembled in the cold air, her hands clutching the small communicator Reed had given her. It no longer worked, but she kept it close, like a promise that had not been broken yet. She waited until the guards shifted, then slipped through the shadows toward a drainage vent half buried under sand. The air inside was thick and damp, every sound echoing like thunder in her ears. She crawled through the narrow tunnel until she reached a grate that opened into the lower halls of the outpost. Voices echoed in the distance, human voices, sharp and commanding. She stayed low, her eyes scanning every corner. A door slid open ahead, and two soldiers stepped out talking quietly. Corvin's furious, one muttered. They say the captain still refuses to confess. Confess what? The other scoffed. That he saved some alien kid? He should have kept quiet. Their laughter faded as they walked away, but Lyra's blood ran cold. Reed was alive, but imprisoned, and Corvin still wanted revenge. She moved through the shadows until she reached a locked steel door marked, holding Section B. Her trembling fingers found the control panel, its lights blinking red. She remembered the human devices she had seen Reed use, the rhythm of the buttons. Slowly, she mimicked the pattern, and with a faint hiss, the door slid open. The smell of metal and dust filled the air. Inside, dim lights flickered along the hallway. At the end of it, through the small window of a cell, she saw him, Captain Reed, sitting on the floor, his head bowed. Lyra's throat tightened, tears stinging her eyes. He looked weaker, thinner, his uniform torn, but the calm fire in his face was still there. Reed, she whispered, pressing her hand against the glass. His head lifted slowly, confusion flashing in his tired eyes. When he saw her, his breath caught, disbelief spreading across his face. Lyra, he murmured, his voice hoarse. You shouldn't be here. I had to come, she said softly. You saved us, now I'll save you. He shook his head weakly. If they catch you, they'll kill you both. She smiled faintly. They'll have to catch me first. Her fingers worked at the panel beside the door, sparks flying as she forced it open. Alarms began to flicker somewhere far above, red lights spinning to life. Lyra, Reed shouted, go. Leave me. But she ignored him, pulling the last wire loose, and the cell door clicked open. He staggered to his feet, his wrists raw from the cuffs. You shouldn't have risked this, he said, breathless. She smiled through tears. You once said mercy has a price. I'm just paying it back. Before he could reply, footsteps thundered down the corridor. Corvin's voice echoed through the halls. Lock down the base. Find them. Reed grabbed Lyra's hand, pulling her toward the maintenance tunnel at the far end. The alarms blared louder, warning lights flashing like crimson stars. They ran through the narrow passages, ducking under pipes and jumping over cables. Behind them, shouts and gunfire echoed closer. Reed's legs ached from days of imprisonment, but he pushed forward. Lyra guided him through the shadows, her memory sharp and sure. At last, they burst through a service hatch that opened onto the outer wall. Cold night air hit their faces as the sirens wailed behind them. Reed turned, helping her climb down the side of the structure using old cables. Once we hit the canyon, they'll lose us, he said between breaths. But luck did not favor them for long. Searchlights swept across the dunes, catching flashes of movement. There, shouted a soldier's voice from above. Bolts of plasma tore through the air, striking the sand near their feet. Reed pushed Lyra down behind a rock, shielding her with his body. "We keep moving," he said. "Head toward the cliffs." They crawled through the dust, every breath ragged, every heartbeat a prayer. When the gunfire stopped, they finally reached the edge of the canyon. Below them lay the same path Lyra had once taken to escape. But this time, she wasn't running for herself. This time, she was running with the human who had believed in her. Reed looked back one last time at the blazing outpost. He knew there was no going back now. The line between human and alien had vanished forever in the desert wind. And as they disappeared into the darkness together, the stars above seemed to burn brighter. For somewhere in that endless galaxy, hope had begun to awaken again. The night faded slowly into pale gold as the first rays of dawn touched the canyon walls. Dust shimmered in the air like ghostly mist while Lyra and Captain Reed hid among the rocks, their breathing heavy but alive. Far behind them, the human outpost burned in the distance, its alarms echoing faintly across the desert wind. Reed leaned against a stone, his arm bleeding from a deep cut, but his eyes were steady. Lyra tore a piece from her cloak and wrapped it around his wound, her hands trembling but determined. "You've done enough," he murmured weakly. "You should go back to your sister." Lyra shook her head. "Not without you." For a moment, silence stretched between them, a silence filled with exhaustion, pain, and something unspoken. Above them, the sky glowed brighter, revealing the outlines of human search ships in the far distance. Reed knew they would soon send patrols into the canyons, but he also knew something else. He could not keep running forever. Lyra sensed it too, her heart heavy but her spirit unbroken. "What will you do now?" she asked softly. Reed looked toward the horizon, his voice calm. "I'll face whatever comes, but I won't let them take you again." By midday, the heat grew unbearable, and Asha appeared on the ridge above them, calling out her sister's name. Lyra gasped, running to her, relief washing through her like light after a storm. Asha threw herself into her arms, crying. "I waited. I was so scared." Reed smiled faintly. "You're quite brave for someone so small." Asha looked up at him curiously. "You're the human who saved us." Reed chuckled weakly. "And you're the alien who reminded me what being human means." They found temporary shelter in an old communications bunker buried in the canyon wall. Inside, the air was cool and quiet, filled with forgotten machines from the last war. Lyra helped Reed rest while Asha explored the dusty consoles, her small hands brushing over faded symbols. "This place once connected worlds," Reed said, "before politics tore them apart." Lyra glanced at him. "Maybe it can again." Reed frowned slightly. "You think it still works?" She nodded. "It might, if we can fix the power cells." Together, they scavenged parts from broken drones and panels. Reed directed her, showing how human circuits worked, while Lyra's nimble fingers repaired the fragile connections. Hours passed, but at last the bunker lights flickered on, humming with faint energy. The console blinked to life, its screen glowing blue for the first time in decades. Reed typed a message, not a military report, not a confession, but a broadcast. "Message to all human frequencies," he said softly. "This is Captain Elias Reed, declaring a call for mercy, not war." He looked at Lyra and continued, his voice firm and steady. "I aided 2 alien civilians because they were starving, because they were innocent, because compassion should not be treason." Lyra's eyes filled with tears as his voice echoed through the static. "Humanity was born from struggle," he said, "but it survives because of kindness." He sent the signal, watching as the message vanished into the ether, reaching satellites and stations far beyond their sight. Moments later, a distant explosion shook the ground. The search ships had found the canyon. "Run," Reed said quickly, pulling Lyra and Asha toward the exit. They dashed through the narrow path as gunfire echoed behind them. The canyon filled with smoke and dust, the world turning red with chaos once again. Lyra stumbled but kept moving, holding Asha close. Reed covered their escape, firing back until his weapon overheated. When the last shot rang out, silence fell, a silence filled with dust and light. Then, a voice came through the static of a nearby radio. "This is Command Station Alpha," it said. "Message received. Captain Reed, ceasefire authorized." Reed froze, unable to believe his ears. The broadcast had reached the fleet, and someone had listened. The soldiers stopped firing, confusion spreading across their ranks. For the first time, orders had changed, not to kill, but to listen. As the sun rose over the dunes, its light golden and soft, Reed stood beside Lyra and Asha, watching the horizon. The world still carried scars, but something within it had begun to heal. Asha smiled, pointing toward the sky. "Look," she whispered, "the suns look gentle today." Reed nodded. "Maybe they finally understand too." Lyra turned to him, her voice trembling with emotion. "You changed everything." He smiled faintly. "No, we did." The wind carried their laughter across the endless sands. 3 souls, 1 human, 2 alien, bound by mercy, defiance, and hope. And as the dawn spread across the galaxy, it marked not the end of their struggle, but the beginning of a new chapter for all species. Because somewhere between hunger and compassion, between fear and courage, humanity had finally remembered its heart.